Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
The seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
Hello, Ryan.
Oh, how are you?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Listen, a real humdinger of an episode with that Gilded Age. I'm looking at these numbers here. You must be very proud.
Yeah, I mean, we are less of a gilded podcast and more golden every day. So,
I have to say, this Gilded Age TV show must be doing very well. I'm guessing based on what we're seeing here, a real interest in the Gilded Age.
Yeah, people are loving the Gilded Age. So maybe it'll get a second season, and we can have him back on and talk more about what's up in Gilded Age news.
And, that means that we obviously have a lot of new listeners and joiners. So just to say, my name's Kiernan Schmidt. That's Ryan Davis. And it's a pleasure to have you here on Out of Office, a travel podcast. We hope you stick with us. Go back through the long back catalog. And hey, you know what? If you like it, would be just really terrific. Give a 5-star rating, maybe throw up a positive comment about what you enjoy about the show. And of course, we always welcome listener feedback and ideas at our email address, which is outofofficepod@gmail.com.
Outofofficepod@gmail.com.
Now, Ryan, I know we are both excited and really want to jump into our episode today. We've been talking about this episode since the very founding of the podcast because it's a city guide for a city that we've both spent a lot of time in. Today, we're talking about Washington, D.C., the nation's capital.
Or WDC, as I call it.
Nobody calls it that, but I did notice you titled the episode. It's not like CDMX. Nobody calls it WDC.
I'm going to make it happen. You can just call it the capital. There's lots of things you can call it.
I think this is a good timely episode because with COVID restrictions loosening up, people getting a little more comfortable getting back on planes, but a lot of overseas travel restrictions still in place and headaches about what tests do I need to get back into the country. A trip to Washington, D.C. feels like just the right thing for this spring and summer.
Yeah, if you want to leave the states, you can go right to the district.
No one calls it the district either. Good Lord. Just call it D.C. Just call it Washington. My God.
The D.C. Yeah, no, I was making a statehood joke.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which, oh boy, would that be great.
Yeah, we want D.C. as a 51st state. Let's do it.
We haven't discussed it, but safe to say it is the stance of this podcast that we would like Washington, D.C. to be 51.
Yeah, no, we support D.C. statehood. So if folks are tuning in from D.C., we're on your side.
Well, if you're on that side.
If you're on that side, yeah.
And Ryan, why have you spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C.?
I think a combination of two things. First is that I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, so D.C. was like a place we went to, go to the city. And then obviously in my professional life and in my career, I've spent a ton of time in D.C. for various meetings and conferences, et cetera. So, it's been interesting because when I was going through the list and thinking about what folks should see, there's just so much in DC. I mean, it's really a town, built for tourism.
Yeah.
We're going to barely scratch the surface of stuff to do in DC. And things like the food scene have changed dramatically since, in the COVID era. So there's just so much new stuff happening that I haven't really gotten a chance to even do yet.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what it's interesting in that it's a city where you have a lot of the attractions that stay the same because they are the big, government-funded, proud symbols of our nation. But then you also, as you say, you have a lot of changeovers, particularly on the restaurant scene. It's because it's really come into its own as a food and drink city. And similarly for me, being from New England and on the East Coast, DC was far enough away that it was always a vacation to go there. But of course, when we both worked together at Blue State Digital, the company kept a kind of a dorm room apartment down there. And we would frequently find ourselves on the Amtrak down and spent, have a lot of meetings while we were there, but make a little time to explore the museums in the city. So
that's a nice that's a nice dorm room, thinking about it.
I mean, it was a pretty nice dorm room. I remember I used to, there were 2 bedrooms in this apartment. And I remember I used to go down there and I used to think, God, Ryan probably slept on this bed last week and God knows what he was doing in here. That would always cross my mind when I was drifting off to sleep.
It was all true. All your worst fears you couldn't even imagine.
I often wonder if Blue State still has that apartment. I remember and I don't know if this was apocryphal, but one of our colleagues, and I'm sure a loyal listener, Rich, had done a little research on the history of this apartment because it was in quite a beautiful old building. And he had discovered, unearthed, or at least spread around the fact that the last queen of Hawaii, when she was coming to Washington, D.C. to basically ask the United States to leave her kingdom alone, lived in this apartment. And you know, it didn't look ready for a queen anymore, I would say.
No. I mean, there were a lot of queens there, but not that kind of queen.
You had stayed there, sure. Now, of course, before we jump into Washington, D.C., we do have just a couple pieces of news that I wanted to highlight. And this begins with a recalculating.
A recalculating?
Recalculating.
Now, Ryan, you remember what recalculating is?
I do. It's been a while since you've made a mistake.
No, it's not just for me making a mistake. It's also updates to things that we've talked about before. And, you know, sometimes It's correcting a mistake that you made. But you're right. We're getting further and further between our mistakes. And this one actually falls as an update, which is in the Gilded Age episode that we were just talking about. We talked a lot about the Newport Cliff Walk. You remember that?
Yes, I do.
Well,
in fact, I was very much looking forward to visiting the Cliff Walk.
Well, I've got some bad news for you, my friend. It was like the day of or the day after we released the episode. We must have caused such a ground-shaking flood of tourists to this famous Cliff Walk, this 3.5 mile track along the ocean behind the mansions, that a big part of it fell into the sea. There was a literal collapse of part of the cliff walk, and it fell into the Atlantic Ocean, Ryan.
So they do want you to know that while they have closed a section of the cliff walk, visitors can still complete it by going around some local streets. They've put up some signage. So it won't be as grand as before, but there's still a cliff walk there, and folks are still encouraged to go out and explore.
And you gotta, it's built on a cliff. Sometimes it's gonna fall. That's kind of the nature of the cliff. And nobody's hurt, by the way. Also good.
Nobody was hurt. The Atlantic Ocean was happy to receive it. So, yeah.
All right. And thanks. Now we're exiting our recalculating. I'm happy to report that we also have a quest for Rick Steves.
Is he coming on the pod?
He's not coming on the pod, but part of the quest for Rick Steves is also following the moves that this man is making out there in the tourism space.
That's
watch
the
Rick Steves beat.
Yeah, that's the tracking Rick Steves part.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in our quest for Rick Steves, I do just want to note he was very early in this, which is he put out a statement, and his company is canceling all planned tourism trips that they were bringing to Russia in response to Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And of course, we are recording this before we release it, about a week before we release it, so we do not know what the state of the war is at this time. Ryan, of course, and I share Rick Steves' disgust, but I thought I would just quickly read the quote from the statement that he put out. Russia's aggressive action is heartbreaking for the death, suffering, and economic turmoil it will cause in Ukraine, and indirectly at least beyond. Our mission at Rick Steves Europe is to help Americans better know and understand our neighbor through travel. But when we bring travelers to another country, we also bring their dollars that would support Putin's aggression. And so they canceled all the tours that had a Russia stop. And while it's sad for those visitors, I think morally, absolutely the right decision. And we want to praise Rick Steves. He's always a guy who follows his moral compass.
Yeah, no, I think this is not a good time to visit Russia. So definitely stand with Rick Steves on that decision.
All right, Ryan. Well, with that, I'd suggest that we get on Amtrak. Maybe we'll see Joe Biden, and let's go down to Washington, D.C. Classic WDC trip.
I'm taking the Acela, so I'll beat you by
you'll be
40
by
minutes.
About 24 minutes.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
All right, Ryan. Well, listen, as you say, I think that we're not going to spend time talking about, the Washington Monument or even the big Smithsonian. So, everybody knows that when you go to D.C., you want to hit the Air and Space Museum. You want to hit the American History Museum. You and I actually think the American History Museum is really tired.
but that is
wow, that's a hot take.
I went a couple years ago, and I have to say they just haven't kept it up. Like some of the, when you compare it to some of the newer Smithsonian's we're going to talk about, it just feels like really dated and tired.
Yeah, so I do understand that. You're right that the many of the Smithsonian's, including one of the lesser visited Smithsonian's I'm going to talk about, they've really invested a lot in keeping the exhibition space very vibrant, new, embracing digital elements. And you're right that at my last visit to the American History Museum, there was not that same sense of modernity.
Yeah, no, I feel, I'm a lover of American history, and I just felt like it's just been a while since they've given that a refresh, and it could definitely use it.
Well, and what's all this old stuff they've got around? Abraham Lincoln's hat. I mean, God, let's get a hipster pork pie from Brooklyn in there, right?
Exactly.
It's time for a refresh.
We need Eric Adams' hat. We need some new stuff in there.
So I think that it's just important to say, if you want to learn about visiting the White House, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, these are the big things that if you only have 2 or 3 days in Washington, D.C., you're only going to have time to do those things. What we're hoping to do today, and this is a part 1, but this is very much a Kiernan and Ryan picks for Washington, D.C. It's not all the heavy hitter things that you want to visit, but it's things that we feel should find time on your schedule. So if you only have 2 or 3 days, maybe pick or choose 1 or 2 of these things to incorporate while you hit the most common attractions. And if you're going on a follow-up visit, or if you have a longer trip, maybe a week, 2 weeks. I think DC actually could keep you busy for 2 full weeks.
Yeah, I think if you were just full-time tourist in DC, you would not run out of things to do in a couple weeks for sure.
And of course, we are recording this in March of 2022. And so we recognize many people will download this later than that. But you should know, there are some COVID restrictions. Some of these museums have odd hours or are closed or have an opening date. But in general, just go to the website before you check it out to be sure it's open. But I want to acknowledge at the time of this recording, some of these things are still just reopening to the public.
Totally. And we've left links in in the show notes for all the various things we're going to talk about today. So you can easily check to see what's open and what's not.
So, Ryan, here's how I was thinking that we would structure this. First, cover off a couple museums, because D.C. is one of the great museum cities. And you and I each are familiar with kind of the big ones, but have gone off the beaten path to see some of the smaller ones as well. So we can each offer a couple of our favorite museums that maybe aren't on that top tier list. Then the second, Washington, D.C. has a lot of monuments, and some of them are pretty far apart. So, and it gets hot there, right? So you really got to decide what monuments are worth your time. And you and I each have a special affection for certain monuments, both on the National Mall and just a couple steps off. So we'll share museums, monuments. And then food, we always have a couple of food recommendations. Try to pick a couple places that stand the test of time. And then just, a grab bag, just a couple thought starters, maybe off the typical attractions list to say, if you've got an extra night, let's put one of these on. So how's that sound?
I think that sounds good. Let's do it.
Fantastic. Well, let's kick off with museums. So, of course, the Smithsonian is the national organization that organizes many of the museums in Washington, D.C. And you've got the big heavy hitters. But there's also a class of Smithsonian that are the kind of tier 2 or smaller museums. And I like these a lot, particularly during heavy tourist season, because they don't get crazy packed. And of course, they are free to the public because our tax dollars fund them.
Yeah, and some of them are hard to get into, so we'll talk a bit about that too. But yeah, the one of the amazing things about DC is almost everything we're going to talk about today from a museum perspective, it's free. It's free to go, which is exciting.
And overseas that can be quite common. In London, you can go to most museums for free. But here it's special with a lot of the Smithsonian's in DC.
Yeah, and it's not like 1 hour on a random Friday either. It's the rule of the museum, so that's a nice thing.
One of the museums that I longtime listeners will know I have an affection for, but I want to replug here, is the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. Ryan, you remember when I talked to the director of that on a previous episode?
Who could forget? Yes, of course, of course. I've signed, sealed, and delivered that right into my memory.
I mean, oh boy, that is really lame. Just gonna stamp out those puns right now. Listen, I understand National Postal Museum might not be something that gets your blood boiling, but it is a wonderful museum, and far more than you might think. A history of stamps and the Postal Service would be. First off, it is just what you were saying. It's refreshed and it's exciting. It's got tons of digital displays, interactive displays, and a lot of artifacts that really trace the history of America more than tracing just the Postal Service. That said,
well, the history of America and the Postal
is a proud
Service
institution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those two things are so intertwined.
And so it can be really fun. Of course, I mean, table stakes. They've got a lot of special stamps that follow major history-making moments, major personalities. It's one of the largest stamp collections in the world, including you get, if you're a real stamp nerd, you get to see, for example, the inverted Jenny. You familiar with the inverted Jenny?
Is that the plane?
That's right. The inverted Jenny is maybe the most famous stamp mistake. Highly valuable in the stamp market, where a biplane was inverted. It was accidentally printed upside down. And so they have that on display there. They have commemorative stamps of the moon landing. And, it just really takes you through the moments in history that the Postal Museum commemorated in these famous icons of America, which are our stamps. Another thing about it is a lot of vehicles. So it's very fun for little kids because you get mail planes, you get mail trains, mail trucks, including, really historic vehicles that show you that living true that the Postal Service was going to get through no matter what the terrain. So they're rugged and exciting. And it also, me, I love kind of obscure miscellanea, just stories that you wouldn't find anywhere else. They've got probably the best story, and I don't want to ruin it for you, is a taxidermy dog named Oni. I have talked about Oni before, but it was a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
And Oni was a dog who famously used to live on the mail trains, and he was like a national celebrity at the time. And they actually preserved Oni, and he's still there. I'll say the taxidermy is not great, Ryan, but it's well worth a visit to Oni.
Preserved poorly for all of history. Only the male dog.
Yeah. And my final plug for the Smithsonian National Postal Museum is it is directly next to the main DC train station. So if you've got an hour to kill before your train, it's perfectly right next door. You can just bring your roller bag over and get to your train on time.
And even if you're not taking the train into DC, if you're flying in or driving in, the train station is worth seeing. It's as somebody who comes to DC a lot from New York, you board on Penn Station. It's not that pretty. Some parts are downright terrible, and then you get off on Union Station in DC. It's so beautiful. It's like a great welcome into the city.
Absolutely. So a good first stop, a good last stop. So Ryan, do you have a museum you want to plug?
Yeah, I want to talk about the National Portrait Gallery. So the National Portrait Gallery is located pretty close to the White House, sort of right downtown there. And it's an incredible museum because it actually houses all the presidential portraits. Well, I know the Obamas are on tour right now, but typically you would have all the presidential portraits in there. And then just like a really impressive collection of American art and American faces, just folks who have made history and have earned a right to be in this museum. It is... I love it. It is a great place to spend, an hour and a half. It's not nearly as busy as a lot of the other museums. So you can sort of just kind of walk in unplanned and spend a good hour and a half there, seeing all these famous Americans. And they've done a good job in recent years making sure that the collection is diverse and represents sort of the broad spectrum of American history. And I think it's it's one of my favorite museums in the city. I often stop by after, I would have lunch and have a little time to kill before a meeting, and that would just be a great place to pop in and see what's new.
Yeah, somehow I feel like the National Portrait Gallery in London gets a lot more play than the American one. I'm not sure why that is.
Yeah, no, not to me. In my mind, National Portrait Gallery, definitely referring to the one in DC. I have spent many an afternoon walking amongst the presidents, and you usually get a lot of space. It is not as popular as it deserves to be because there's also like a massive American Museum of Art that is maybe more popular because it's larger. But I think to really get a feel for DC, the Portrait Gallery is a place to go.
Now, Ryan, another one that I want to draw the attention to, this is stepping away out of the Smithsonian system. This is a private collection, and it's considered the first modern art collection in the United States. And it's called the Phillips Collection, Phillips. And this is the museum founded by a couple, Duncan Phillips and Marjorie Acker Phillips, founded in the 1920s. And they were avid collectors of many, many great artists whose name you would recognize. They have Renoirs, El Greco, Van Goghs, Matisse, Monet, Picasso. I mean, just on and on and on. And so it's almost like you get like a mini MoMA experience. I'm also just such a big fan of collections that come from a singular point of view, right? Like the collector's feeling for these artists. And it was one of the museums, too, that spearheaded arranging rooms not chronologically, but having pieces of art kind of speak to one another and grouping them based on colors, based on themes, and other connections that personally Duncan and Marjorie felt they saw. And I would compare it. I love the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. The Phillips collection has a similar feel to me.
Is it located in a similar space to where they founded it, like the Barnes collection, or like?
Yep, it's a historic home that has been expanded to include other galleries over the years. So you do get a sense for the house, but it was very much created to be a museum collection for the public. And two things that are really notable inside that I would ask you to seek out when you go. The first is, very famously, they have a Rothko room that Mark Rothko helped design. And it's four of his, very typical, big, quintessential, colorful paintings. And apparently Rothko had a preference for his very large paintings be experienced in a small, stark space. And so it's a room that is designed exactly to be that experience. So you're almost overwhelmed by the color and power of the works directly around you, because they're quite close together and close around you. The second, and this is my personal favorite part of the museum, and it might be there and it might not, because this is actually a collection that is jointly owned between the Phillips collection and MoMA. So it does travel, and it does tend to go to regional museums as well. It's a collection called the Migration Series by an artist named Jacob Lawrence. And it's a 60 painting series that tells the story of the Great Migration, of the African-American story of moving masses from the South up to the North in search of jobs, in search of greater freedoms and acceptance. And it's extremely moving. It was actually financed by the WPA program. So a lot of it comes from the 1930s. It entirely comes from the 1930s. And it's fitting for a travel podcast to spotlight it, because there is a travel and movement are the guiding themes of it. So there's a lot of people, a lot of suitcases, a lot of trains. You get the feeling of kind of family drama. You get the weariness of the travelers who are uprooting themselves, looking for greater opportunity in the North. And together, these 60 pieces are just extremely moving. They were painted not one after the other, but actually they were painted all at once. So where he was using colors in one, they would cross across all of the 60. So it's a very, very tight sort of unit altogether, which is why it's extraordinary to see it. And with 60 pieces, you really get to talk to your companion or to a guide there about the themes that run through all the 60 pieces and the many different stories it tells.
That sounds incredible. I've been to DC so many times, and I don't believe I've ever even heard of this collection.
Oh, it's a must visit.
And looking at the map, it's located pretty close to DuPont Circle, which is sort of the neighborhood in DC, and it's a great place to walk around. So if folks are going to the Phillips collection, take a couple hours on either side of the visit to sort of explore that area. There's a lot of cool stuff there: bookstores, cafes, etc.
Absolutely. And, I also just want to plug with the migration series. It's very honest about the painful experiences, including the discrimination that Black people found upon coming to the North. It looked different than discrimination in the South, but they still experienced it. And it's very clear-eyed about the history. So I also find that very moving, and definitely seek it out. And I will say we'll put a link in the show notes to the migration series online, because even if you can't make it to the museum, great works of art and very browsable online.
And my next pick is actually a museum that looks at really uncomfortable truths, and that is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this is the newest of the
Hard
Smithsonian.
ticket to get.
It is a hard ticket to get. Yeah, no, I would advise folks to get their time tickets in advance. When I went back in 2017, I had months to get in. Now I think you can get in easier, but definitely check out the website and make sure you get those time tickets. But this opened in 2016. It's a massive museum that looks at the history of African Americans in the United States, and it goes in sort of chronological order. So you get a real feeling of the history as you're walking through the building. Going through all the various moments, from slavery to the civil rights movement to modern day. It sort of ends in 2008. Obama's election is sort of like a high point of the exhibit, but it really brings you into the history. And as somebody who grew up in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, there's so much about Maryland, obviously, that has to do with the slave trade and was a very divided state. So just seeing a lot locally resonated with me, seeing my area of the Eastern Shore and the various things that went on there. But it's an incredible museum. There's a lot of different highlights. And I think that if folks, this would be where I would recommend folks go, as opposed to something like the American History Museum, which is really tired. This is something that I think is going to open your eyes. You're going to learn a lot. It's an exhausting experience, but it's very, very rewarding.
And emotionally exhausting.
Emotionally exhausting. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and as you say, it is the history of America as much as the American History Museum is being branded. So I'm very jealous that you've gotten in. When I've been to DC recently, it's been very hard to get tickets. So if you're going in advance, I do think timing it out to make room and building your schedule around a visit to this museum would make it very special.
Yeah, I think of all the Smithsonian's, as I said, this is the newest one, and I think has a very modern sort of approach to how it looks at these issues. So a big success, and definitely a major addition to the Smithsonian museums in DC.
I'll also say the building itself from the exterior is its own experience. We can link in the show notes to a great explanation about the architecture, but it's extremely symbolic, and it's basically got this outer lattice that has images punched into it, and it's really quite the feat of engineering.
Yeah, they had a massive design competition. Over 100 firms submitted ideas for the site, and it ended up costing over $500 million. So it's an extraordinary building, and it really changes sort of that whole road and what it looks like.
And the lattice work itself, which sits above the kind of glass encased building, is an homage to ironwork created by enslaved people in the South. And so, that history it brings you in even from the exterior. So if you get unlucky and you can't get in, certainly at least pay the building a visit. You'll see it. I mean, it's right in the main area where you'll be seeing a lot of the other tourist attractions.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that area now without this massive building.
Yes. Well, and Ryan, we can wrap up the museum section here. I'd just like to plug, because we're always such a fan of the national parks. One thing that you should look into is when you're in DC, you're going to notice a lot of giant monumental looking government buildings that don't look very welcoming. And it's true, you're not welcome in most of them. I mean, these are the inner workings of the government, and they have huge office buildings there. But one place that you might be able to visit, and it's currently closed because of COVID, but it should be opening soon, is the Department of the Interior actually has a museum and gallery space inside. And I once attended a great show of those classic rediscovered WPA National Park posters.
Oh, that's
where
like that's like your dream show. Kieran.
It was a dream show, and it really turned me on to them. And now, I've gotten a bunch of them. But it's rotating. They spotlight different parts of the park system, different pieces of the history all around the United States with a focus on nature. So the Department of the Interior Museum often gives you a quirky place. It's good AC, and on a hot DC day, probably won't be too packed. And I just love, tiny little ones like that are kind of hidden away and aren't the big Smithsonians.
Yeah, another one for my list that I haven't been to.
There you go. Add it on.
Well, let's talk a bit about monuments. One of the biggest mistakes I think tourists make when they come to DC is they go to the National Mall, they see the Washington Monument, they see Lincoln, and they don't actually sort of take that walk around what we call the tidal basin, or where the big reservoir is. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of interesting monuments sort of off the beaten path are.
Absolutely. And it's a beautiful outdoor activity on its own. And particularly when the cherry blossoms are out.
Oh, yes, the cherry blossoms. DC is always pretty beautiful, but definitely when the cherry blossoms are out, it's really special.
So the peak time for these cherry blossoms is beginning of April. So if you're hearing this now, you better book soon.
Yeah, and when you're in the city, then you can't miss them. It really brightens up the whole outdoor area.
And so the tidal basin will bring you across some of the better known monuments. Particularly, I'm thinking of the Jefferson one, right?
Yeah, so that gets you to the Jefferson one. That's sort of the end of the route. So I think you wanted to talk a bit about the FDR Memorial, what you'll walk by as sort of you go around the tidal basin. What speaks to you about that?
So the FDR Memorial, it's one of the relatively newer memorials. It was opened in 1997, but had been in development for decades before. And there's a couple things that I like about it. First, of course, I think it just honors a great president who saw us through the Depression and World War II. But there's a couple elements that I think are much more directed at storytelling than I would say other monuments are. It's conceived as 4 rooms that you make your way through. And each one kind of tells the story of each of FDR's 4 terms. But the 2 pieces that I especially highlight and advertise as a reason to visit the FDR Memorial. Firstly, it shows FDR in a wheelchair. And that was controversial at the time. President Clinton, during its conception, weighed in that he felt that it should represent FDR in a wheelchair. And that's because while FDR in his own time did not like to be seen in leg braces or in a wheelchair, our understanding and acceptance of disabilities has, of course, progressed and evolved. And now it's not something to be hidden. It's something to be acknowledged. And of course, the FDR Memorial is extremely accessible. That was a major point when they were conceiving how these rooms flow into one another. And I think it's a great thing that we see FDR in his wheelchair and not, hiding this disability and the fact that we've had a disabled president. That's something to celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that we had a disabled president who was arguably one of our most successful presidents ever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, it gives a good sense of FDR's personality. I think they don't go crazily out of their way to make him look, super brave and kind of cleaned up for the experience. They show him with his beloved dog, Fala. And it's a much kind of warmer statuary than I think you get at some of the other monuments. And I also love that this very progressive memorial, if you will, celebrates Eleanor Roosevelt. So you get a full statue of Eleanor Roosevelt, recognizing her as the first representative to the UN for the United States. And, she too was such an extraordinary person that I love that they don't just keep it to the president.
Yeah, and it's also a little bit about the time that the president, about the Depression, and there's a lot of FDR's, famous words about the 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms, four freedoms and 4 terms, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's a way to remember it. So yeah, it's sort of more spread out too than a lot of the other memorials, right? You go to the Lincoln Memorial, we're going to talk about the MLK Memorial. It's sort of like right there. Yeah. But this is a little more spread out. You can really spend some time and sort of learn a little bit about FDR too.
Absolutely. And now, Ryan, speaking of great Americans, from FDR onto MLK.
Yeah, continuing your trip around the tidal basin. you'll get to the MLK Memorial. And the MLK Memorial, I believe, is the newest on them all. I think it's from 2011. So it sort of has that new memorial feel. It's a really beautiful statue of Martin Luther King, surrounded by some of his most famous speeches. And of course, Dr. King gave his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, just steps away on the Lincoln Memorial. So you can kind of really get a feel when you're reading those words. You're standing sort of where that happened. It's pretty interesting. Having the Martin Luther King Memorial now and the African American History Museum in DC, a city that is very, has a large Black population. It is about time that the folks got to really feel recognized by these big things in DC. So it's great to see, and it's obviously one of the most important non-presidents we ever had.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting now, though, is that so you've gone through, you've hit FDR, you've seen Martin Luther King, and now kind of ending up at the tidal basin, you end up at the Jefferson Memorial. So we've really gone the full gamut here.
Yes, and quite the interesting and important recognition of Thomas Jefferson's complicated history right next to MLK's. That's I think the story of America is captured well along this walk.
Yeah, in the African American History Museum, they have a statue of Jefferson, and behind him are 600 bricks, and each of those bricks represents one of the people that he owned. So you can't think about Jefferson without acknowledging the complexities of his history and the horrible things he was involved in.
Indeed. But of course, they also do create space for some of his most soaring rhetoric, his most famous documents. It was conceived also of recognition of his genius in the creation of the government.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is another one where you sort of walk into it, and the way that you walk into the Lincoln Memorial, and you really don't understand how grand it is until you're standing sort of inside underneath sort of all the various Jefferson imagery and words. It's a powerful experience. And you have an amazing view from that area. You turn around all over the reservoir, great view of DC and all the various monuments. It's one of my favorite views of the whole city, actually, from that spot.
And Ryan, there are memorials that live outside of the National Mall. And one of the ones that I want to particularly recommend, and it's not just because I'm a proud Ted Head Theodore Roosevelt enthusiast, is many people don't recognize that there is this monument that is off the sort of DC beaten track on this island in the Potomac. And it's called Theodore Roosevelt Island. And have you ever heard of Theodore Roosevelt Island?
Not until I was reading the script yesterday. So no, tell me about it.
So it is this island. It used to be called Mason's Island, where they have created a forest that mimics kind of the natural ecosystem that would be in this area. Should DC not sit on this land because of Roosevelt's enthusiasm for nature. But it also sprinkles throughout some memorial pieces to Theodore Roosevelt himself. Particularly, there's one court where these giant slabs have kind of his most famous words, and a statue of him, a huge statue of him giving a fiery speech. And you could go to the island without realizing that it is a memorial to Theodore Roosevelt, because there's extensive trails that you can do on Theodore Roosevelt Island, but they also bring you to this main court where the memorial itself is. So
what a fitting way to recognize Roosevelt by giving him some nature trails.
It's brilliant. It absolutely captures TR. I don't think that there would be a greater way to recognize his work in conservation and also his just personal enthusiasm as an outdoorsman. And so you can set aside time. It does take a little bit to walk to it. It's not far from the Kennedy Center. So if you're over in that area of DC, take the time to cross the bridge and get down to Theodore Roosevelt Island. You can walk to it. It is connected to the land. You don't have to take a boat. But make time to take in the nature, to refresh yourself. It's a good way to get nice and sweaty before heading inside to some of those air-conditioned museums.
I got to put this on my list too. I'm getting more from you on this episode than I usually do, Kiernan. This is
you always got to slip in an insult. Well, Ryan, having visited so many museums and memorials, surely you're going to build up a decent appetite here.
So DC is a fantastic food city. It had a bad reputation for years, but during the Obama years, ton of places opened up, and I think the food offerings really diversified. Now, DC is known for Ethiopian food. Refugees who fled in the 1970s and 80s, they sort of settled into DC, and there's an area known as Little Ethiopia, which is on 9th and U Streets Northwest. One of the things we should have mentioned about DC, it's confusing. It's divided into quadrants, so Northwest, Northeast. You can have addresses that look like they're one place. Be very careful to what quadrant of the city that it's in. But I would recommend, if you just are a fan of Ethiopian food, you want to give Ethiopian food a try. It is awesome in DC, and sort of any place around that area in Little Ethiopia, just stop in and just have lunch or something. It's a cool experience. But a couple other places that I wanted to shout out. I'm a big fan of Watergate and sort of that history.
Is that how you want to say that?
Yeah, well, of that history of that time,
Sure,
it's an exciting, interesting time, and the Watergate Hotel is still alive and well. Now, there's a restaurant in the Watergate Hotel that I think is overpriced and not that interesting. One of the things you can do is stop by their bar. It's called the Next Whiskey Bar, and it's a very 70s sort of retro place. So go in there and have a drink and sort of look around. You get the Watergate experience without having to sit through a long meal. That's not going to be that satisfying. So it is a cool place to visit, and they make good drinks at the Next Whiskey Bar.
Ryan, among the places that I've been, but I don't know. I feel that I should mention them if giving just maybe a measured recommendation. One thing that's fun about DC is people do really like to incorporate a lot of history, almost in a kind of kitschy way. And this does include into the restaurant scene. So I don't know if you've ever been. There's a place called Lincoln, the Lincoln restaurant, and then there's Teddy and the Bully Bar.
Yeah, of course.
And they're silly, they're fun. The food's actually pretty good at both of these places. The decor is something that's worth going in for. There's lots of portraits that capture the personalities of the presidents. At Lincoln, I remember that a good portion of the floor, they've
pennies.
encased pennies. Exactly. Yeah. So, these are fun places to visit. And I think they bring some of the fun of the presidency and American history into the DC experience. So I did want to just quickly plug those. But another place that I would recommend, you know who Jose Andres is?
Oh, of course. America's chef.
Yeah, America's chef, exactly. Proud. Well, he has a Michelin-starred restaurant called Zeytinnya. And Zeytinnya is, it's kind of pan-Mediterranean, the foods of Greece, Lebanon, and Turkey. Very elegant, very high class. This isn't a place that you're going to want to go, in your t-shirt and sandals straight after a day of museuming. This is like a high class, nice night out. You probably want to have some money to spend on some good wine, but it's very light meze style food that is extremely delicious, very vegetarian friendly. Salads, flatbreads, very modern sort of take on this Mediterranean cuisine. And I recommend it totally. It's definitely a place that hooking a reservation before you go would be a must because it's very popular, particularly as Jose Andres has become more famous.
Yeah, and it's right by the National Portrait Gallery, so it makes a good addition to that. And I would shout it out for brunch. Their brunch is amazing, and it's a little more casual, and you get all that amazing light coming through those windows. Great brunch there.
Speaking of casual, I did also want to plug my pick. Ryan, you remember I used to be considered somewhat of a sandwich influencer back in New York City.
Yes. I still think of you as a sandwicher.
Oh, thank you very much.
Sandwicher, yeah.
And when I used to go down for work, I always made sure to search out some of the best sandwiches in Washington, D.C., and it is a very good sandwich city, though I'm sad to say some of my favorite places have gone out of business. But the one that has stood the test of time is a place called Sundevich, and that's a little bit of an odd name. It's Sundevich. And it now has a couple of locations, but the one that I like is actually built in an old garage, and it really feels like a converted garage when you visit. It's in Naylor Court, which is in the Shaw neighborhood. So this is a step or two away from the Memorial Museum area, but well worth seeking out. They're famous for their crunchy French bread, really fresh ingredients, and you really can't go wrong with anything at Sundevich.
I've never had a sandwich there, and I consider myself a bit of a sandwich expert. So,
as you say, you're coming along for the ride along with all of our listeners today.
Yeah.
And I will say the what's difficult about it is you do get quite a line at Sundevich because it has a local population fan base as well. And then for those who are clued in the tourist track, they know to seek it out.
And I'll give one more recommendation, and this is, again, on the lighter, more casual side. A cool place called Busboys and Poets.
I don't know this place.
Yeah, so this is sort of like a cafe, bookstore, event space. They've always got, readings going on and lectures and cheap, good food and drinks. And it's a really fun place to hang out. They had one in the city that opened like in the early aughts, and now they have a couple different ones. But I always find it a cool place to stop by and kill an hour and read and sort of wait for my next big event. So Busboys and Poets, always something going on, and buy books from independent bookstores. So
Ryan, now we've fed you, we've liquored you up. I think this final area should be just the grab bag, things that don't fall into the common categorization of museums, restaurants, and monuments when you visit DC. What else do you recommend people make time to do?
Yeah, so this was a tough one because there's still so much that I kind of wanted to unpack. But
keep in mind, this is just part one.
I know.
We're going to come back. We're going to come back.
So, DC is a great walking town. And one of the neighborhoods I love walking around is Georgetown. It is full of beautiful houses, little cafes and bars and restaurants. It is, architecturally one of the more, kept up and sort of beautiful neighborhoods. And you have the added benefit of being able to actually walk up and down the steps from The Exorcist, which the steps I'm talking about. So it's a cool moment, great photo opportunity, and a great way to kill a sunny afternoon is just to sort of walk around Georgetown and see all that it has to offer.
Yeah, and the Georgetown campus is also just a beautiful historic place to trundle around and get inspired by the scholarly pursuits about you. And of course, a Catholic university, we have to tip our hat to that.
Hey, that's The Exorcist. That's The Exorcist tie-in right there.
Exactly right. And Ryan, I don't know if you think of me as much of a sportsman, but I would actually recommend that you make time to go to a Nationals game if you can. This is the Washington Nationals, the
baseball team,
the Major League Baseball team. Very good, Ryan. And of course, it's fun to take in a baseball game, particularly if it's an exciting matchup. But the reason that I am recommending it is because they have something called the President's Race. And that's the mascots of the Washington Nationals are the four presidents who are on Mount Rushmore. So you got Washington, Lincoln, TR, and Thomas Jefferson. And they have, your typical mascots, big heads, silly costumed characters. And in the middle of the fourth inning of every game, they do a race where they actually have the mascots run on the field and race each other. And it always gets very silly. There's a bunch of hijinks. And occasionally they even introduce a new president. So they had Taft on for quite a while.
Not much of a runner, Taft.
No, no. But you've had Calvin Coolidge, you've had Herbert Hoover. So you never know who's going to show up to these president races.
They should do Bill Clinton in his jogging gear from his famous McDonald's jogging.
That's good.
Yeah.
I don't think they've ever done a living president, as far as I know.
Well,
I mean, I think you and I could also
on.
agree. I mean, also, if they did an Obama, he would beat them by leaps and bounds. I mean, that's a slim, healthy man.
Yeah. I mean, Obama's still, as young as can be. So, yeah, no, it's funny. I have been to the Nationals stadium. Mm-hmm. It is very cool. It's in an area of DC where that has just exploded in the last decade. The Navy Yard.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
There's just a lot going on down there. Some great Georgian restaurants randomly. It's a cool space to walk around too. I've not been to a game there, but I've been there for conferences.
Well, it's a great neighborhood. Nationals game is fun. The race is fun and silly. They used to have a big tradition that TR never won Sadly, they ruined that, which they did let him win, which I thought was a shame because, you know, you never want Charlie Brown to kick the football. That's kind of the game.
Yeah. Well, and they also play, you know, the team. They're okay, right?
Yeah, you're going to have to ask somebody else about that, Ryan. But however, I will say just this one last interesting fact. I didn't know this. So they always do the president's mascot race in the middle of the fourth inning. But apparently, if you're in for a long game, if there is a fourth extra inning beyond the 9, in the fourth extra inning, they will run another race, a second mascot race in the middle of that. So I'd love to know what that, you know, secret playbook is just in case.
Yeah, no, when they get up to 18 innings, what happens?
All right, Ryan. Well, that wraps up Washington, D.C. Part 1, the Ryan and Kiernan picks. And now I think it's time for the last stop.
The last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
Now, Ryan, we're here in the last stop. This is the final segment of the show, the last segment of the show. That's where the name derives from, last stop. But it's also references, of course, when a train reaches its final destination, they'll call that the last stop. And it's my favorite segment. It is your favorite segment. It's popularly known as the people segment. And it is a moment of quiet, of peace, of sharing and communion. Because we each bring of ourselves and our own experience one singular thing to share with each other and with the audience. I think it brings us closer together as a community. And that thing, it's broadly defined. We're not nailing this down. It could be anything. It could be a book. It could be an article. It could be a dream. It could be something that you're planning, something that you've bought, anything that, as long as it fits this one piece of criteria, anything, as long as it inspires the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workaday week. That took me a second. I almost forgot it.
You forgot what the last stop was.
16 times. So, Ryan, I have to ask you, as I've asked you 115 times before, do you have a last stop this week?
So I've been planning my birthday trip to Mexico City, and was trying to think about, you know, on the way back, is there anything interesting I can do? And you know me, I'm a sportsman as well.
Absolutely.
And I have a favorite boxer, this guy named Ryan Garcia, who is, a hell of a boxer. He's never lost a fight. Got a lot of knockouts.
God, I've never known that you like boxing.
I'm getting into it. So
this is sick. This is sick stuff.
It just so happens that Ryan Garcia is returning to the ring for the first time in about a year in San Antonio, a week after my birthday. So I haven't been to San Antonio since I was a small child. So I'm going to be going to San Antonio, watching this fight.
Oh my God.
And I'm going to check out the Alamo and do all that stuff. But I'm very excited.
Fun.
This is my first ever boxing match. I will be attending in person. So that is, it's good to open up our horizons. You turn 40, you want to do new things.
Wow. I'm saying wow, both at your age and the fact that you're a big boxing fan. I mean, this is all just shocking.
Yeah. Well, let's go King Ryan. He's going to win this thing.
You only like it because it has your name. If there was a boxer named Kiernan, I'm sure I'd be a fan.
Yeah, Google him. It will be less surprising. But yeah. Do you have a last stop this week, Kiernan?
I do. So Ryan, I'm still currently on paternity leave with my new daughter Penelope. And one thing that's lovely is that when you're rocking a baby and they're napping, you have a lot more time for reading. So I'm very up on my New Yorkers, and I've actually had the ability for the first time in a little while to be digging into some books in my catalog here. And one book that's been sitting on the shelf that I've had for a long while and I've really been desperate to read, is called Greek to Me by Mary Norris. And Mary Norris, fans of The New Yorker may be familiar with Mary Norris. She's a famous copy editor at The New Yorker. She's been there for decades. She calls herself the comma queen, had a very funny online video series around punctuation and language. And so I've always been a fan of her, very dry sense of humor. And this is the story, both of her career at The New Yorker, and that's just a touch of what she gets into. She really joined the New Yorker before it was taken over by Condé Nast, in its last breath as a totally independent kind of sanctuary for idiosyncratic writers and weirdos. And the reason that ties into the story that she wants to tell, Greek to Me, is because she actually convinced the New Yorker that it would be it would give her a skill related to her work if they would pay for her to learn ancient Greek.
Wow.
And so in this kind of heyday of eccentricity at the New Yorker, they agreed to cover her tuition costs to study ancient Greek and then eventually modern Greek. And she just completely fell in love with the Greek islands and the Greek people, culture, the ancient history, and visiting it in the modern day. And so she takes you on a travelogue. So the book is a travelogue of her experiences over the years, going back to Greece, spending months in Greece. And now I've never been to Greece, and I will say that this book fits the spirit of The Last Stop completely, because it makes you want to put Greece right at the top of your list. It just sounds so enchantingly beautiful.
And do you want to learn Greek now?
Well, I will say it's a fun dive into the complexities of learning a language, particularly with a different alphabet, but also in your older years, because she wasn't picking this up as a teenager. She was in her 20s, and then she's continued that study through much of her life, moving out of the classroom to private tutors. She's extremely funny about her own abilities to mess up the language, but the romance of being able to read text and speak to locals in their own language. So it's also a really nice meditation on the importance of language. And, she hits a lot of those moments where people want to speak English to her, but she wants to speak Greek back to them. And very, very funny. So Greek to Me by Mary Norris, a pretty light read, a very fun read, and will feed your spirit of wanderlust. Absolutely.
Oh, that's a perfect last stop.
Thank you very much.
Well, until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
It's also much more fun to visit DC when a Democrat is president.
Remember when we got that angry email from the city of the presidents, Rapid City, because we made fun of Trump?
I do remember that.
Imagine introducing Trump as a character in the president's race.
A
Just
lot of
lay
booze.
down and die right
A lot
at the
of
beginning of
booze.
the race.
Just be eating a hamburger.
Well, I was thinking they could put a Big Mac at the end of the race. He'd beat them all.
Clinton might win too, though. That would complicate
Good
things.
point.